Okay, so please let's welcome Professor Malcolm Dando as the next presenter.
Okay, so I don't know very much about drones. I think military drones are an important issue which will become more important in the future. But I thought it probably would be better if I spoke about something I know about. And so my talk is titled Neuroscience and the Future of Chemical and Biological Weapons, 12 Reasons for Concern. First reason for concern is that we have an international treaty, the Biological and Toxin Weapons Convention, which was agreed in the early 1970s after the United States closed down its massive offensive biological weapons program. And this treaty adds to the 1925 Geneva Protocol, which bans the use of chemical and biological weapons, adds a series of other restrictions in which state parties undertake never in any circumstances to develop, produce, stockpile, or otherwise acquire or retain microbiological agents or toxins. A second reason for concern is that at the end of the Cold War in the 1990s, state parties to the Chemical Weapons Convention agreed that they would also add to the Geneva Protocol and the Biological and Toxin Weapons Convention, and that each state party to the convention undertakes never in any circumstances to develop, produce, otherwise acquire, stockpile, or retain chemical weapons, or transfer directly or indirectly chemical weapons to anyone. So the first conclusion you can reach is that during the 20th century, major states, most states, considered chemical and biological weapons a significant enough threat, to go to the trouble of creating two big international conventions and to attempt to take care of their development. A third reason for concern is when you look at the history of civil neuroscience and advances in chemical and biological weapons during the 20th century. It's quite clear, for instance, that very shortly after the understanding that acetylcholine was a neurotransmitter, sarin and the G series of nerve agents were discovered in civil pesticide research in Germany in the 1930s. Similarly, the V series of agents were discovered in civil work in the UK during the 1950s, and that produced even more deadly nerve agents than the G series. Again, the incapacitant BZ, weaponized by the United States, was actually developed in civil medical research, and when it was discovered that it had effects on the central nervous system, all of that work was transferred over to the military. And you can make similar general points about the development of bacteriological, viral, and toxin weapons. So we have a history of work in the civil sector on neuroscience, facilitating, underpinning the development of chemical and biological weapons. A fourth reason to be concerned is the weakness of the treaties. The Biological and Toxin Weapons Convention is well known to be weak because it has no effective verification system, no effective organization to take care of it, and there have been severe difficulties in agreeing any kind of action in the intersessional processes which have been carried out ever since the failure of the attempt to produce a verification protocol in the early part of this century. Chemical Weapons Convention has surely been very successful in ridding us of the huge amount of dangerous, lethal chemicals developed during the Cold War. But it has problems because now it has to turn to exactly the same question as the Biological and Toxin Weapons Convention, at how do we prevent the further development and proliferation of new chemical weapons. And therefore the lack of agreement about what the meaning is of Article 29D, which says that a peaceful purpose could be law enforcement, including domestic riot control. Possibly, in some minds, opens up the question of developing law enforcement chemicals of a different kind from domestic riot control. And of course, there's a huge disagreement about whether production by synthesis is just confined to chemical synthesis or whether the increasing importance of biological synthesis means that biological synthesis has also got to be brought in under the control of the verification system. Of course, the fifth reason is what Michael was talking about, the possibility of dual use research of concern. Personally, I think this has been useful in raising awareness and producing a debate which some scientists are taking an interest in. But I also think that as an understanding of a problem of biosecurity in the coming century, it's far, far too narrow a concept to concentrate just on single scientists, single experiments, and bioterrorism seems to me to misunderstand the problem that we have. What's quite clear, if you look particularly at the American Brain Project, where their objective is set out very clearly in the following way. The challenge is to map the circuits of the brain, measure the fluctuating patterns of electrical and chemical activity flowing through these circuits, and to understand how their interplay creates our unique cognitive and behavioral capabilities. There is absolutely no doubt that the aim here is a mechanistic understanding of the brain. And that means to me that it also opens up the kind of possibilities of malign misuse that Michael was talking about. And though I understand that the European project is much more IT-centered, it still seems to me that in order to do anything useful in understanding the brain, it will have to draw on the same kind of biological information that the American project does. Another reason for concern is a clear military interest and concern about these issues. There have been a series of reports set out, particularly in the United States since the turn of the century, which show quite clearly that there are military interests and military concerns about what might happen if neuroscience is further followed in military applications, particularly in the area of chemical and biological warfare. There is also clear concern amongst states. For instance, this is an Australian statement in the Chemical Weapons Convention meeting in November of last year. Weaponization of central nervous system acting chemicals for law enforcement purposes is of concern to Australia due to the health and safety risks and the possibility of their deliberate misuse, both of which have the potential to undermine the global norm against the use of toxic chemicals for purposes prohibited by the Convention. And it would be very easy to find you a whole raft of such issues being brought up by states, both in the Biological Weapons Convention context and in the Chemical Weapons Convention context. Moreover, if you look at what's going on in the area of neuroscience, it's hard not to focus and fix on various ways in which there could easily be malign manipulation of the advances being made. When you think of the developments in our understanding of the sleep-wake cycle, consequent on the discovery of the orexin hypocretin neuropeptide, which under the absence of which produces narcolepsy. When you look at, yes?
I'm afraid that I have to be very strict and cut you off a bit in order to also make room for questions. Is that okay? Would you like to make a final point, or?
Just one more point.
Yes, that's all right.
It's the changing nature of warfare in the 21st century. Mechanized warfare that we understood in the 20th century does not occur in anything like the way it did. What we're dealing with here is what General Rupert Smith called wars amongst the people. and wars amongst the people of the messy kinds that we see going on in Syria at the present time. And these kinds of wars obviously could give rise to some people seeing utility in new forms of chemical and biological weapons. Thank you very much for this last point. I would like to now open up the floor for discussion. I would like to ask Professor Karl-Heinz Meyer as the first panel member to ask a question.
Well, yeah, I can start, although I must say after listening to this presentation, I'm definitely the wrong person to ask questions here because, you started your presentation saying that you know very little about drones and computing, and you really want to focus on the chemical and the biological aspects of neuroscience, which of course is very, very important. But we should have different people from HDP here. I mean, of course, there is work done in fundamental neuroscience and with all the pharmaceutical and medical and biological aspects. But my own field of research is computing, in particular brain-inspired computing. And I thought that in this discussion we would focus a little bit on that area, because as you pointed out, HDP is really a project that has a strong activity in computing. So my question to you then is, after listening to your presentation, which brought all these aspects of biological and chemical warfare and the ethical aspects that are related to those kind of things, in which sense are your statements generic? If we know that there are things like there is the information age, there is information available, there is big data available, and there are new approaches to use this big data, for example, by using brain-inspired computing, which will produce certainly ethical concerns and ethical aspects which we need to discuss in the project, which so far we haven't discussed in this webinar. So my question to you is, in which sense are the statements you made in your presentations generic and can be transferred to the aspects of information science? I'm sorry I didn't manage to get to my last two points. So let me get to the last but one. What is generic is that in neuroscience at the present time, you have very, very diverse groups of people with very different backgrounds coming in to take part in the development of neuroscience. And computer people, mathematicians, engineers, all of that diverse group are coming in to deal with to help with the development of neuroscience, which I'm all in favor of, I should make clear. But what's fundamental is that very, very few of them will have any understanding of the history of the misuse of this science. There is a huge gap in the education of almost every neuroscientist that we've come across, in that this problem of biosecurity, the possibility that the whole of this science and technology will be turned over in a major way to warfare, is just not there on their agenda. And therefore, the general point is that they cannot take part, engage in thinking through how we best protect their benignly intended work from misuse, because they don't even recognize that there's a problem. And that's the key point that we need to understand. And it really comes back to what Michael was saying.
Karl-Heinz, would you like to respond?
No, that was interesting. Thank you.
Okay.
More questions on your list?
Yes, Nicholas Rose perhaps would like to ask a question.
Yep. Thanks, Lise. Can you hear me, Malcolm?
Yes, I can hear you, Nick.
Okay. Thanks for your very helpful and absolutely terrifying inventory of all the malign consequences of neurochemical research, or research on the neurochemistry of the brain. Now, the thing that worries me about that is that, in a sense, almost any knowledge of the functioning of the human brain can be utilized for malign purposes. In the list of things that you raised, it seems to me that almost any research, no matter how basic, that increases our understanding of the operation of the human brain, that is mechanistic in your terms, the more we understand the brain as not mystery but mechanism, mechanism that we can, in a sense, reverse engineer and then re-engineer, then the more the brain becomes open to calculated interventions. So your list of concerns, which is kind of compelling, would be a caution against almost any neuroscientific research, whether it's chemical or whether it's based on the sort of computer-based regimes of investigation in the HBP. So what then should any neuroscientist do?
Well, Nick, just to say that I'm a neuroscientist by background a long time ago, I go along very strongly with what Michael said at the beginning, that the neuroscientists do not have the whole of the responsibility for protecting their work from misuse. In fact, my concern about the debate on dual use, research of concern, is that that appears to put all of the emphasis on the responsibility to be on the scientist. I think what we have to say is that scientists do have a part of the responsibility. And in my mind, that part of the responsibility is for them to know that there is a problem, to teach their students that there is a problem, and to engage themselves in their professional societies in understanding the difficulties we have in strengthening and maintaining the international prohibition. So that if we had more neuroscientists who are aware of the difficulties that, for instance, there are in Geneva in agreeing any kind of action to strengthen the convention at the present time, we would end up with a stronger convention, a stronger prohibition, and therefore much less chance that we will end up in decades to come with massive use of this benignly intended work for malign, hostile purposes. So it's not, we don't want to stop the work, we don't want to say that scientists are totally responsible. All we want to say is, let's get on and do the good work, but as part of that, let's make sure we understand there is a problem and do what we can to help prevent it.
Okay, Lise, can I have one more question to Malcolm?
Yes, please.
Okay, I mean, there are some interesting differences between the European and the American Brain Project, which maybe will come up when Jonathan talks. In the American Brain Project, of course, there's direct investment of 40 or 50% from DARPA in the Brain Project, and there are explicit attempts to develop interventions that will enable transformations of brain states, something like the old-fashioned Jose Delgado stimulus, which isn't happening in the Human Brain Project. So maybe leave that till later. But the specific question I wanted to ask you was about conventions. The conventions that you talk about of chemical and biological warfare have been moderately effective in banning state actions. Would you imagine something like a more general convention about neurotechnology, which use the same kind of terms to try and regulate, at least at the legal level and the level of treaties, the use of neurotechnologies for malign purposes, non-chemical, non-biological neurotechnologies, electrical and computing-based?
Well, I'm aware that there's been some very interesting initial work by a number of people on trying to think through whether there are ways in which we could have an international convention to deal with the problem of weaponized autonomous drones. So it seems to me that it's a very good idea that issue is pursued by those security-minded people with the assistance of people working in neuroscience and neurotechnology and information technology. But I would say that they would have to understand that it would take a lot of effort over quite a long period of time, but still well worth doing, and the kind of action by neuroscientists which I'm very much in favor of.
Okay, let me just ask you one last question. Of course, in DARPA in the United States, DARPA is a defense research organization. It's concerned with the defensive use of, in this case, of neurotechnology. You don't want to make that distinction between the defensive and the offensive use of neurotechnological research?
I think we'll listen to what Jonathan's got to say about DARPA later on, but it seems to me that there are some things which DARPA are doing that you and I would actually probably be very much in favour of. And we'd both be in favour of the fact that, to an extent, they're open about what they're trying to do, so that at least civil society has got a chance to comment on it. What is worrying is that there are probably quite a lot of things that DARPA is doing that we don't know about, and which we can't comment on. But the underlying point, surely, is that both the Human Brain Project in Europe and the American Brain Project is going to propel us towards a much more mechanistic understanding of the brain, whoever's funding it, and that we have to think very carefully how we protect that work that we would like to have done to help people with problems is kept that way, it's kept benign, and that we don't end up in that terrible abyss that Matt Meselson warned us about at the turn of the century, where we have the whole of the life sciences and the revolution of the life sciences being used for hostile purposes and transforming the nature of warfare.
Nicholas, would you like to respond, or should we pass the word to the next speaker?
I think it's a real dilemma that you're posing for us, because exactly the same knowledge of the brain and the neurotechnologies developed in relation to it might be used for peaceful purposes, for development of neuroprosthetics, or the capacity of people who have spinal cord injuries to manipulate robots to assist them. Exactly the same technologies might be used for brain-inspired manipulation of weaponized drones. And it's very, very difficult, in my view, to try and disentangle that basic research from its applications. Much as I don't like to talk about the difference between the research and its applications, use and misuse, that seems to me perhaps the situation that we're in here, where the research is amenable to a range of different applications, some of which some people will applaud, and some of which some people will disagree with. And we ought to have a disagreement. We ought to have a debate about the applications, maybe, rather than about the research itself.
The main thing, Nick, is we protect the benign work that we want to do, in part by making it clear to civil society that we're aware of this problem and that we're trying to think it through and do something about it. Okay.
Thank you, Professor Dando, for this last point, and thank you both for the discussion and the questions. I would like also to encourage the audience members to ask questions. If you have questions during the discussions, to post them in the chat forum or just to post them directly to me.